Okay. Sorry to make it so formal, but already mentioned in the last talk, my co-editor Catherine Schofield, who's a historian of music, and she's done a project between North India and the Malay on musical transitions through European colonialism, and she says in these regions operating multiple languages was normative, so we need to place different languages back into dialogue. So the idea that, as I was saying last time, and I think we agreed in other regions as well, being multilingual is normal, is normative. And if last time I said, archives which tend to be monolingual and we organize this around single language traditions and create then monolingual histories do not help us, we can train ourselves to look for traces and then think back to what practices and habits or communities of tastes the traces point to. And today I want to suggest two more strategies for placing languages and traditions back in dialogue. One is a spatial approach, and the other is to think of utterances of language, particularly literary utterances, as dialogical. So even if they're in one language, or if it's coming from one source, that they are actually dialogical, and I'll explain what I mean. So just to remind you what the kind of language landscape was, and if we come to the 19th, 20th century, we can add English to the high languages, the cosmopolitan languages, and then kind of going by Emmerich definitions of language, one bhasha language, called Hindi, generally Indian, by Persian sources, and then two varieties, you could say, that to register that become varieties really, that become cosmopolitan languages of literature. And languages, particularly the vernaculars, can be written in more than one script. So space, contiguity, I think are useful analytical lenses to explore both familiarity and contact between languages, between people who are working particularly in different languages. As we said, access, exposure last time, but also of course ignorance and aloofness or exclusion that may characterize what I call multilingual locals. So the idea that, again, it's not, multilingual is not happy. Multilingual can also be, yes, you are there, but I'm pretending that you are not there, or I'm not interested in you. I think this becomes particularly clear in situations which are in zones of conflict. So, as I was saying last time, Sri Lanka, so there's not an organic multilingualism, but you could say it's the same local, but if you're Sinhala, you may have nothing to do with Tamil and the other way around. Or Ethiopia, as I was saying, so where if you have any other language that is not Amharic, you will, for decades, Amhara speakers, literary critics, and Western literary critics who work on Amharic will say, well, Amharic is Ethiopian. So there are other languages, but they're just not considered. And I found, in thinking about space, and particularly in the sense of space as a multilingual, plural space, Doreen Massey as the most useful thinker to think about, because she puts she actually defines space as the product of interrelations and constituted through interactions, whether it's a very small local or it's the world. So it's never one, whether it's local or world. And in fact, that if you have one story, then it means that there are other stories that you're not, other trajectories and other stories that you're not seeing. So without space, no multiplicity. Without multiplicity, no space. So the idea that there will be other stories, other languages, if not inside the text or the person, then outside. And also it defies totality. The idea that you're never going to get a complete picture either of the world or of the local. then I think what I particularly like here as well is the last point about the vantage point. So again, the idea of the local or as a standpoint. So space as a standpoint as well. Not just thinking about circulation in general or networks in general, but from a standpoint. And for me, sorry to go. So this is the area that I work on, which is actually. So I suppose the eastern area of, so this is in the eastern area of UP. For me, the most striking, perhaps, experience or result of working through space was to actually make an object that, if you only worked with single language traditions, was not there. And so actually, you could make objects appear through a sort of spatial and multilingual approach. So, for example, devotion to the god Krishna was a big, produced a lot of poetry, a lot of stories, singing, and so on. Is but if you look at Hindi literature of the early modern period, Krishna devotionalism, Krishna Bhakti, as it's called, is like a big. There's a lot of literature written for it, but it's always been told from the point of view of the groups that developed, that institutionalized and coalesced what we call Sampradaya in India. And now for them, and they tend to be placed either in the area where Krishna supposedly lived, here in Braj, or Bengal or Orissa. So basically this area, which is in the middle, it doesn't exist in the archive of Krishna devotionalism. And actually, it was going through from a set of partly Persian works, or partly not texts that were not originating from these particular groups, a Sufi version of the Krishna story that then actually suddenly you start seeing that, oh no, there was something, there was Krishna devotionalism in this area, and actually there were several, there was a story, a Harika, a Katha, a story of Krishna in the town of Raebareli. There was another story in verse in the town of Jayas. There was a singer, Parmanan, who was singing about Krishna in the old city of Kannauj. There was a Persian Sufi, the one I already mentioned about Tracy's last time, who's saying, when you listen to songs about Krishna, he's writing in Persian, saying, if you listen to songs about Krishna, this is what you should understand. There's another Sufi who is watching Krishna performances. So suddenly the landscape becomes populated with an object that otherwise wouldn't appear. Finding voices, or finding either voices, can actually be or often is a kind of multi-step process. So, for example, we have quite a lot of works, particularly in Persian, from another small town called Bigram. So this whole area, as I said, it's an area not with big cities, but with a lot of towns, Qasba as they're called in Persian. And actually, through their writing, the kind of the literati of the town of Bigram managed to put their town on the map. So, it's not Bigram, it's not the only map, but actually through their writing, you could say their self-promotion, the writing of poetic dictionaries from people from Bigram. By the 18th century, you've got these geographical works that say, oh, there are like four big centers in this area, one of them is Bigram. So actually writing, of course, is a big way in which you can put your local on the map. And as I said, I mentioned the biographical dictionary of Persian poets of Bigram by Azad, the 18th century, in which he has a chapter of elite Muslims, Sayyids and Sheikhs, who also write poetry in Hindi of the time, in Braj Bhasha. But he doesn't mention any other who is not a Said or Sheikh, who is also doing them. So he said, you know, for example, who have they learned from? I mean, if they, and actually it's in his grandfather letters that we have, and he's gone to Delhi, he's trying to sort of sort out his job and so on. He's trying to get an audience with a local sort of power holder in Delhi at the time, and poetry is the way in which he can sort of impress him. And so he, at some point, writes to his son, who's still in Migrant, who says, please get me some Hindi poems by so-and-so. Get me some Hindi poems by Harbans Misra or Divakar or Ghasiti, anybody, because I need them, because this power holder wants them. But and it's another step. There's actually a local history of Migrant in the late 19th century, which gives much more detail of the various localities. It says there's a Bhartpura with the Bharts, who are local genealogists and praise poems. Some are famous among the community. For example, Rai Ghasita, who is the same guy, Rai Prashad, who knew thousands of Arabic and Persian verses by heart. So actually, none of this you will know from Azad's text alone. So again, we see Azad's text and we think, oh wow, fantastic, he mentions Hindi. But actually you need more steps to find out who the other, who the non-elite Muslims who are doing poetry are, and then you find out that actually some of the Hindu, so Rai Ghasita, Rai Prashad, who do Hindi poetry also know Arabic and Persian. So you know, you can see how you get a different, you start getting a different image of the space. Now the next, so finding other voices, other stories can require several levels of inquiry, even for a single multilingual local like the town of Migrant. The other thing that I found really interesting in thinking about space and multilingualism and the multilingual local is the kind of also the need to move from text to space, back to text, back to space. And I want to just tell you a bit of a story of another kind of local, multilingual local, another of this town called Kara. So Migrant was over there, Kara is over here. And I was looking for, I wanted to see where one of the kind of famous, but what I said last time was called, three-line poet. He's actually quite famous, Maluk Das. There's a couplet that's famously attributed to him that, the python doesn't work and the bird doesn't work, God looks after everyone, so says Maluk, which in the 19th century became, oh my God, this Hindi poetry is really spoiling people by telling them to be lazy and God will provide. So everybody knows this couplet by Maluk Das. And the first time, and I was really interested because this was that kind of non-elite poetry that I was telling you, circulated a lot orally, and interestingly again circulated a lot orally, even in print, in the early 20th century through chapbooks. So there was a particular publisher in Allahabad that collected and brought up a lot of these little, from manuscripts, collected little chapbooks of their sayings, so in particular ways, and those are actually have been reprinted for 100 years. So that's actually all you get on Maluk Das even now. So I went with my little booklet to Kara, trying to find Maluk Das, and there was not, so it's on the river Ganges, and as you can see, there's not much of a town there. It's a big bustling place, but not much of a town. And actually you go and there's this compound, there's a statue, there are various sayings of his, there's a bit of the wall of his house.
Which may or may not be.
Which may or may not be. It says, here Maluk Das ka ghar hai. But so there wasn't that much. There was an empty modern courtyard with a modern, rather generic marble statue of Maluk Das sitting, some older and some definitely newer saying in very modern Hindi, painting on the wall a few scenes from his life, and in an underground cell where he was supposed to be meditating. And even the pandit, the priest who was there, who was had been brought in newly by the last guru of the lineage. And there are no devotees who come, and even the local villagers now, you could say, who meet once a week, they don't sing Maluk Das songs, they sing another sort of common prayer. And when I asked the priest if he had any manuscript, you think you're going to the place where you find some manuscript, he showed me this photocopy of of a modern of a modern kind of big notebook that had been photocopied and then sort of wrapped up like a manuscript. So I was clearly disappointed in it. Now, Kara is a historic kasbah. It's been there since at least the 12th century, but there was very little evidence of it having been densely inhabited. And we went, as we went back to Allahabad, we stopped at this compound. There were several Sufi shrines and Sufi tombs, and this was the biggest one of the 13th century Sufi Raja Karaksha. But without stories, Kara looked rather empty and disconnected, with sort of large spaces in between. And it was only when I went back to London and I found, I got a copy, somebody gave me a copy, of the biography of Maluk Das written by his nephew. I got a better edition of his works, and also a Persian text of the 14th century written, which was a kind of collection of sayings of the Sufi, that both figures started to acquire some texture and some depth. And I also was, so I got back to the text and got various sources. I was so lucky to find this early 20th century short local history of Kara, written in Urdu, and a typically insightful essay by Christopher Bailey on Kara as a Muslim gentry town. So this, local histories filled Kara's empty spaces with the names of various localities. These, for example, are all the ghats, the bathing steps that were built, built with bricks along the Ganges. There's another similar list with all the bazaars of Kara, all the names of the various communities that were there, and they are, Gujaratis. You've got people from, really all over, Pathans, and really from all over. Tombs, so you start getting a list of all the various tombs of Sufis and so on, governors, local notables, communities of inhabitants. So after having been to Kara, and in the effort to connect these various different texts that spanned 7 centuries to the spaces I had seen and to each other, that I again started to get a more dynamic and less generic sense of the place. And interestingly also, so what do we find out? We find out that the guy of the compound, Karak Ahmad Shah, who was the most famous holy man of Kara, who came with his brother to trade from Transoxiana, from Central Asia, and died there in 1301. And these are tombs of various even Sultanate period princes and princesses in his compound. And the Persian text that talks about him presents him as sitting in the bazaar. He's not really linked to any sort of silsila Sufi lineage, but he's sitting in the bazaar or in the local wine shop. And when people, shocked people smell his wine, it smells of rose water, who responds to the visitor's request, performs miracles, redistributes the gifts that he receives, and occasionally composes Persian verses or engages in musical sessions with Hindi singers. Now, the interesting thing is that he actually figures also in Maluk Das' biography. And this is quite unusual, because usually you have Sufi hagiographies, or sort of biographies of famous Sufis, who have lots of anecdotes about yogis. So a lot of kind of competitions over local power and sacred power between Sufis and yogis. And some hagiographies will also biographies of these Hindu saints, devotional saints, would feature Brahmin Pandits or Muslim governors or judges as the kind of the figure that they interact with. But Sufi and Sant archives, quite pointedly, do not mention each other. So what does the biography of Malouda say? That he was born in a family of traders who sold blankets, but soon renounced the world and started to compose and song devotional poems. His name spread. Okay, sorry to make it so formal, but already mentioned in the last talk, my co-editor Catherine Schofield, who's a historian of music, and she's done a project between North India and the Malay on musical transitions through European colonialism, and she says in these regions operating multiple languages was normative, so we need to place different languages back into dialogue. So the idea that, as I was saying last time, and I think we agreed in other regions as well, being multilingual is normal, is normative. And if last time I said, archives which tend to be monolingual and we organize this around single language traditions and create monolingual histories do not help us, we can train ourselves to look for traces and then think back to what practices and habits or communities of tastes the traces point to. And today I want to suggest two more strategies for placing languages and traditions back in dialogue. One is a spatial approach, and the other is to think of utterances of language, particularly literary utterances, as dialogical. So even if they're in one language, or if it's coming from one source, that they are actually dialogical, and I'll explain what I mean. So just to remind you what the kind of language landscape was, and if we come to the 19th, 20th century, we can add English to the high languages, the cosmopolitan languages, and then kind of going by emic definitions of language, one bhasha language called Hindi, generally Indian by Persian sources, and then two varieties, you could say, that to register that become varieties really, that become cosmopolitan languages of literature. And languages, particularly the vernaculars, can be written in more than one script. So space, contiguity, I think are useful analytical lenses to explore both familiarity and contact between languages, between people are working, particularly in different languages. As we said, access, exposure last time, but also, of course, ignorance and aloofness or exclusion that may characterize what I call multilingual locals. So the idea that, again, it's not, multilingual is not happy. Multilingual can also be, yes, you are there, but I'm pretending that you are not there, or I'm not interested in you. I think this becomes particularly clear in situations which are in zones of conflict. So, as I was saying last time, Sri Lanka, so there's not an organic multilingualism, but you could say it's the same local, but if you're similar, you may have nothing to do with Tamil and the other way around. Or Ethiopia, as I was saying, so where if you have any other language that is not Amharic, you will, well, for decades, Amhara speakers, literary critics, and Western literary critics who work on Amharic will say, well, Amharic is Ethiopian. So there are other languages, but they're just not considered. And I found, in thinking about space, and particularly in the sense of space as a multilingual, plural space, Doreen Massey as the most useful thinker to think about, because she puts she actually defines space as the product of interrelations and constituted through interactions, whether it's a very small local or it's the world. So it's never one, whether it's local or world. And in fact, that if you have one story, then that means that there are other stories that you're not, other trajectories and other stories that you're not seeing. So without space, no multiplicity. Without multiplicity, no space. So the idea that there will be other stories, other languages, if not inside the text or the person, then outside. And also it defies totality, the idea that you're never going to get a complete picture or either of the world or of the local. Then I think what I particularly like here as well is the last point about the vantage point. So again, the idea of the local or as a standpoint. So space as a standpoint as well. Not just thinking about circulation in general or networks in general, but from a standpoint. And for me, so this is the area that I work on, which is actually so I suppose the eastern area of, so this is in the eastern area of UP. For me, the most striking, perhaps, experience or result of working through space was to actually make an object that, if you only worked with single language traditions, was not there. And so actually you could make objects appear through a sort of spatial and multilingual approach. So for example, devotion to the god Krishna was a big, produced a lot of poetry, a lot of stories, singing, and so on. But if you look at Hindi literature of the early modern period, Krishna devotionalism, Krishna Bhakti as it's called, is like a big. There's a lot of literature written for it, but it's always been told from the point of view of the groups that developed, that institutionalized and coalesced what we call sampradaya in India. And now for them, and they tend to be placed either in the area where Krishna supposedly lived, here in Braj, or Bengal or Orissa. So basically this area, which is in the middle, it doesn't exist in the archive of Krishna devotionalism. And actually it was going through from a set of partly Persian works, or partly not texts that were not originating from these particular groups, a Sufi version of the Krishna story, that then actually suddenly you start seeing that, oh no, there was something, there was Krishna devotionalism in this area, and actually there were several, there was a story, a Harika, a Katha, a story of Krishna in the town of Raibareli. There was another story in verse in the town of Jayas. There was a singer, Parmanan, who was singing about Krishna in the old city of Kannauj. There was a Persian Sufi, the one I already mentioned about Tracy's last time, who's saying, when you listen to songs about Krishna, he's writing in Persian, saying, if you listen to songs about Krishna, this is what you should understand. There's another Sufi who is watching Krishna performances. So suddenly the landscape becomes populated with an object that otherwise wouldn't appear. Finding voices, or finding either voices, can actually be or often is, a kind of multi-step process. So, for example, we have quite a lot of works, particularly in Persian, from another small town called Bigram. So this whole area, as I said, it's an area not with big cities, but with a lot of towns, Qasba as they're called in Persian. And actually, through their writing, the kind of the literati of the town of Bigram managed to put their town on the map. So, it's not Bigram is not the only map, but actually through their writing, you could say their self-promotion, the writing of poetic dictionaries from people from Bigram. By the 18th century, you've got these geographical works that say, oh, there are like four big centers in this area, one of them is Bigram. So actually writing, of course, is a big way in which you can put your local on the map. And as I said, I mentioned the biographical dictionary of Persian poets of Bigram by Azad, by the 18th century, in which he has a chapter of elite Muslims, Sayyids and Sheikhs, who also write poetry in Hindi all the time, in Braj Bhasha. But he doesn't mention any other who is not a Sayyid or Sheikh, who is also doing them. So he said, you know, for example, who have they learned from? I mean, if they and actually it's in his grandfather letters that we have. And he's gone to Delhi, he's trying to sort of sort out his job and so on. He's trying to get an audience with a local sort of power holder in Delhi at the time. And poetry is the way in which he can sort of impress him. And so he, at some point, writes to his son, who's still in Migrant, who says, please get me some Hindi poems by so-and-so. Get me some Hindi poems by Harbans Misra or Divakar or Ghasiti, anybody, because I need them, because this power holder wants them. But then, so another step, there's actually a local history of Migrant in Urdu in the late 19th century, which gives much more detail of the various localities. It says there's a Bhartpura with the Bharts, who are local genealogists and praise poems. Some are famous among the community. For example, Rai Ghasita, he is the same guy, Hari Prasad, who knew thousands of Arabic and Persian verses by heart. So actually, none of this you will know from Azad's text alone. So again, we see Azad's text and we think, oh wow, fantastic, he mentions Hindi. But actually you need more steps to find out who the other, who the non-elite Muslims who are doing poetry are, and then you find out that actually some of the Hindu, so Rai Ghasita, Rai Prasad, who do Hindi poetry also know Arabic and Persian. So, you know, you can see how you get a different, you start getting a different image of the space. Now the next, so finding other voices, other stories can require several levels of inquiry, even for a single multilingual local like the town of Migrant. The other thing that I found really interesting in thinking about space and multilingualism and the multilingual local is the kind of also the need to move from text to space, back to text, back to space. And I want to just tell you a bit of a story of another kind of local, multilingual local, another of this town called Kara. So Migrant was over there, Kara is over here. And I was looking for, I wanted to see where one of the kind of famous, but what I said last time was called, three-line poet. He's actually quite famous, Maluk Das. There's a couplet that's famously attributed to him that, the python doesn't work and the bird doesn't work, God looks after everyone, so says Maluk, which in the 19th century became, oh my God, this Hindi poetry is really spoiling people by telling them to be lazy and God will provide. So everybody knows this couplet by Maluk Das. And the first time, and I was really interested because this was that kind of non-elite poetry that I was telling you, circulated a lot orally, and interestingly again circulated a lot orally, even in print, in the early 20th century through chapbooks. So there was a particular publisher in Allahabad that collected and brought up a lot of these little, from manuscripts, collected little chapbooks of their sayings, so in particular ways, and those are actually have been reprinted for 100 years. So that's actually all you get on Maluk Das even now. So I went with my little booklet to Kara, trying to find Maluk Das, and there was not, so it's on the river Ganges, and as you can see, there's not much of a town there. It's supposed to be a bustling place, but not much of a town. And actually you go and there's this compound, there's a statue, there are various sayings of his, there's a bit of the wall of his house.
Which may or may not be.
Which may or may not be. It says, Ye Maluk Das ka ghar hai. But so there wasn't that much. There was a empty modern courtyard with a modern, rather generic marble statue of Maluk Das sitting, some older and some definitely newer saying in very modern Hindi, painting on the wall, a few scenes from his life. and in an underground cell where he was supposed to be meditating. And even the pandit, the priest who was there, had been brought in newly by the last guru of the lineage. And there are no devotees who come, and even the local villagers now, you could say, who meet once a week, they don't sing Maluk Das songs, they sing another sort of common prayer. And when I asked the priest if he had any manuscript, you think you're going to the place where you find some manuscript, he showed me this photocopy of of a modern of a modern kind of big notebook that had been photocopied and then sort of wrapped up like a manuscript. So I was clearly disappointed in it. Now, Kara is a historic kasbah. He's been there since at least the 12th century, but there was very little evidence of it having been densely inhabited. And we went, as we went back to Allahabad, we stopped at this compound. There were several Sufi shrines and Sufi tombs, and this was the biggest one of the 13th century Sufi Raja Kara Shah. But without stories, Kara looked rather empty and disconnected, with sort of large spaces in between. And it was only when I went back to London and I found, I got a copy, somebody gave me a copy, of the biography of Maluk Das written by his nephew. I got a better edition of his works, and also a Persian text of the 14th century written, which was a kind of collection of sayings of the Sufi, that both figures started to acquire some texture and some depth. And I also was, so I got back to the text and got various sources. I was so lucky to find this early 20th century short local history of Kara, written in Urdu, and a typically insightful essay by Christopher Bailey on Kara as a Muslim gentry town. So this, these local histories filled Kara's empty spaces with the names of various localities. These, for example, are all the ghats, the bathing steps that were built, sort of built with bricks along the Ganges. There's another similar list with all the bazaars of Kara, all the names of the various communities that were there, and they are, Gujaratis. You've got people from, really all over, Pathans, and really from all over. Tombs, so you start getting a list of all the various tombs of Sufis and so on, governors, local notables, communities of inhabitants. So after having been to Kara, and in the effort to connect these various different texts that spanned 7 centuries to the spaces I had seen and to each other, that I again started to get a more dynamic and less generic sense of the place. And interestingly also, so what do we find out? We find out that the guy of the compound, Kara Ahmad Shah, who was the most famous holy man of Kara, who came with his brother to trade from Transoxiana, from Central Asia, and died there in 1301. And these are tombs of various, even Sultanate period princes and princesses in his compound. And the Persian text that talks about him presents him as sitting in the bazaar. He's not really linked to any sort of silsila Sufi lineage, but he's sitting in the bazaar in the local wine shop. So when people, shocked people smell his wine, it smells of rose water, who in response to the visitor's request performs miracles, redistributes the gifts that he receives, and occasionally composes Persian verses or engages in musical sessions with Hindi singers. Now the interesting thing is that he actually figures also in Maluk Das' biography. And this is quite unusual, because usually you have Sufi hagiographies, or sort of biographies of famous Sufis, who have lots of anecdotes about yogis. So a lot of kind of competitions over local power and sacred power between Sufis and yogis. And some hagiographies will also biographies of these Hindu devotional saints would feature Brahmin Pandits or Muslim governors or judges as the kind of the figure that they interact with. But Sufi and Sant archives, quite pointedly, do not mention each other. So what does the biography of Malouda say? He was born in a family of traders who sold blankets, but soon renounced the world and started to compose and song devotional poems. His name spread. Magazines, for example, like Quest, but we've got tons of magazines in Indian languages. We've got a lot of magazine activism, a lot of translation culture across Indian languages. And you've got Cold War internationalism, which also, in a way, make English more the medium for other literatures like Russian or Chinese or Eastern European, rather than the kind of the Western European or American kind of reference point, definitely. So it's important to historicize and then to think of the 1990s with new liberalization, with a new comfort, with also English as a sort of greater presence of English within Hindi, certainly within advertising, with a stronger sense of the language ladder, with the boom of English as a global language, where, as I said last time, mother tongues or first languages are seen as a handicap. And where you also have, with also the boom, so these are all kind of different elements, a boom of publishing, English publishing within India, a boom of genre, literature, and of the Anglophone as well globally, which makes literatures in Indian languages less visible outside India, also in a sense less, a bit more isolated and more minoritarian within India itself, but also makes non-English literature less visible within the Indian market. But so I think, rather than say, oh, it's the same, it goes from the colonial to the now, I think they are actually quite different moments with quite different sets of factors and different dynamics. And I think it's true, as I said last time, that for families, languages get bound very dramatically with education, resources, jobs, socioeconomic mobility, so that, as I say, they are imagined as a steep ladder that you discard the lower languages, you climb up the ranks. But I think historicism, and I think that's the point of my work, is that I think historicism multilingualism shows that it's not always been like that, and that it doesn't have to be like that. Because, as I said last time, languages don't just have a functional value, and learning new ones doesn't require you discarding the ones you already have. And I've been looking for a different metaphor from that of the ladder to try and say, okay, how do you talk and convey this idea of languages that it's not naturally just a hierarchy. And you can help me. I'm thinking about languages like rooms in a home or windows in a house. Why would you want to live in a house, in a smaller home, with fewer rooms or with fewer windows, if you already have them? And finally, tracing the history of multilingualism means realizing not only how even texts that are written in a single language are part of the multilingual world. It means valuing the access to different aesthetics that multilingualism gives, whether one is a connoisseur or one simply enjoys listening to ghazals, songs, or stories. And Zoya, the protagonist of a chick lit novel, The Zoya Factor, by Anuja Chauhan, thinks, so she's a young woman who arrives in Australia and thinks people who only know one language is weird. Because, hello, what will they switch to if they started getting pally or angry or fell in love? So, what happens when you think of the multilingual condition as the normal one, and then the monolingual as the kind of the weird one? Right, I think I can finish here.
Actually, it's a nice trajectory from the earlier lecture
Yes.
to this, taking us from an earlier period to now. But one of the things I wanted to ask you is that why you spoke about the idea of space, and space being a set of relationships, space being composed of utterances, and people bridging gaps between their particular identities and so on. It's interesting that when we think about multilingualism, multilingualism probably happens only in certain spaces. So for example, if we take Kara, which is a bustling town, there's the presence of migrant workers, there's the presence of soldiers, of wandering mendicants or Sufis and so on, where you have a place within which there are all of these people circulating. Would there have been multilingualism in a very rural area, for example, where it's largely peasants who have been there? There would be the occasional trader who came in and so on. And it's possible that people from that, peasants from that area who went to work in other areas, came back, carried some trace of the language, but it was not something that became embodied in a local culture. So if you think about spaces now as well, to the present, if you think about migrant labor in India, right, there are spaces where, like Rajasthan, where there are lots of people who go out of Rajasthan, because it's a poor area, out of Bihar, to the poorest states, and they go to other areas, they work in other areas, they pick up languages, and they create in the spaces that they go a multilingual world, but when they go back to not so multilingual worlds. So Kerala, for example, right now, you have people coming in from Assam, from Bihar. So it's like at least 6 people from at least 6 language groups who come to Kerala. And they create a multilingual community, which is the other complication, which doesn't reflect in broader social relations, that within the migrant laborers there's a kind of community which is multilingual. So it gets fractured at various levels in terms of time, space, location, and so on.
And in fact it's not. So, as I say, I mean, I like kind of I think being specific and being precise always helps, because you do get quite different typologies of literary dynamics. I mean, it seems to me, however, that when you get to because education, I think as I said, you had Urukara, last time, the one who strolls through Persian. I mean, he grows up in a village and he learns Sanskrit. And he learns, Brajbhasha, he must be speaking another language. So there's something, as I said, in the structure of something like education that already is multilingual per se. You get, so it's quite interesting, for example, the language of the sons, so this, which is a very popular, we've got manuscripts as well, but a sort of a set of poetry and devotion that circulates orally. I mean, so they call it a Kichri Bhasha, so kind of a mixed language, because in fact it's not the language of any particular place. So, but Kabir is sung everywhere. So again, it's not, it depends on degrees of multilingualism, but in the sense that it's not even a village would probably not be a monolingual space, just because if there's anybody who's educated, if anybody sort of has any interest in poetry, if anybody has a devotional, interest, if there are Muslims, then practicing, there would be some Arabic and possibly some Persian there. I mean, it's interesting. One of the writers that is particularly attuned to multilingualism, like Renu, I mean, he writes about villages, and they are very multilingual, even if they are villages. He writes about an area and kind of border area between Nepal and Bengal, also in which you have refugees, you've got, and so and he actually records, and with pleasure, so the villagers, some villagers have been to Calcutta, worked in Calcutta, they remember Bengali songs, they come back to the village, and when some Bengali refugees from Bangladesh come to near the village, they want to go because they want to hear those songs again.
Right.
So there are of course it would be a different from the bustling town, from even bigger cities and so on. But still, I think when again, if you start looking, there are ways in which somebody was telling me that, you know, because of exogamy, you know, so your bahu, the wife, will come from another village, and the idea that, you know, she will be called as the woman from that village, and the idea that, oh, that language is slightly different. Of course, could be minor, but there will be some certain words that are different. So I think there is the idea that Hindi itself, which is supposed to be, you know, the language of this area, you know, former Hindi will be, you know, like a foreign language that you have to learn. So, and that of course English as well. So, yeah, I mean, to me, it's not just about the town, but really to see, okay, what. I mean, I think it helps in every way to also see, even so why I'm also interested in the local, because, you know, it's easier to think of cosmopolitanism, or it's also easier to think about people as being worldview when they are, you know, in the centers, when they are traveling and so on. But I want to think of these people also living, you know, being worldly and living in the world, and actually maybe through stories, through songs, you know, having access to imaginaries that are broader than you know, the space that they live in. But also, you know, fractures even within the village. So again, not thinking of the local as necessarily a kind of a state. I mean, as we know, caste, you know, religion, and so on, can be very divisive as well. So.
I would like to learn a little bit more about monolingualism and nationalism.
Yeah.
Is there a direct link? And for our context here in South Africa, so we now and again get guests internationally.
No, absolutely.
When I interact with them,
or
you Zulu, and no, I'm not Zulu, I'm Soto. But then, so I was just interested to learn a little bit more about that, and perhaps I could maybe be referred to.
Yes, no, absolutely. No, it's good. So I mean, as I said, the project at the moment is not just about India, because, you know, I think this whole kind of certain ways of thinking about, or it's either, even when you accept multilingualism, there are only certain languages that you are that you want to be in a relationship with, and others, you know, you want to discard, or you don't see your language or yourself in a relationship with. So I suppose I don't know if it was the case here, but certainly in India, certainly in Italy, where I'm from, you know, nationalism is very, you know, in Italy we have a poem that says, you know, one of arm, one of language, and one of religion. You know, so that's how you can become and heroes. You know, so that's how you can become a nation, because otherwise you won't become. You will always be divided. Now the problem is that, you know, how do you, which, you know, what does it mean? And then it becomes a question of choice, and it becomes a question of, as I was saying last time, it becomes an either or. You know, so you have to decide on one language rather than decide on a kind of maybe more of a compromise that says that, you know, compromise that says both this and that, you know. So as I said last time, in India now it's very much like can. You know, so the idea is that languages will always be antagonistic to each other. So you're either in this camp or in that camp. And the idea that instead, you know, I mean, it's good to have, I suppose to balance, you know, practicality with, say, language rights. To recognize people as being multilingual.
Yes, sorry, it's just that my transport's already here.
All right,
I'm kind of deferring it down. It was great to be here.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you for coming.
Just let you
And again, I think with language rights, then people are supposed to be, so language right is for this community or this group, and then you are imagined as a linguistic minority who is the carrier of that language rather than, you know.
So I was intrigued because I think, I don't know that you mentioned it, because I remember you going from the boom of English to the boom of English publishing. What about the Hindu?
Yes, yes. Well, well, I mean, if we think of, historicising multilingualism now, there's also, I mean, you can see that a certain sense of Hindi as being a mother tongue, the daughter of Sanskrit, so very Sanskritized, so rejecting other words as foreign. I mean, you can find it already, from the 19th century.
Right.
Now I think there's this kind of really interesting, but for example, going away from more into politics, I mean, with the current government, the pressure on even politicians, ministers who are not Hindi speakers to speak Hindi. So, a greater.
Yeah.
Although of course there is a given, basic contradiction that even Hindutva people want to have their children getting good jobs and going abroad and being English as well. So again there's a kind of projection of a monolingualism as a link to identity. So then the other languages of course are and certainly Urdu is like nowhere there. But in a sense there's a tension between the ideology or different language ideologies basically. So there's a political one and then there's a kind of more pragmatic one, and they are clashing.
So there is the kind of the policy of language, or the language policy as it's called, which dictates a dominant language, dictates a landscape of languages, so that any country has 21 or 11 languages. But at another level, there's the everyday multilingualism of people who are constantly on the move, working in other spaces. And so in that sense, multilingualism is also located in the movement of peoples. So it's, and whereas this policy is very much a top-down thing, and connected to the idea of one language. So the multilingualism is as against the presence of one language which is conceived as being
and I was saying, then the other languages, okay, it's sort of, it's like now the discourse of language rights,
Right.
But then it's a minority, you are the person who has that language, and we have to make space for you, rather than, okay, you are the person who has that language, but who also may have two more or one more. Another thing I think is quite interesting is language maps. So language maps tend to think of. I mean, maybe sometimes there are overlaps, but it's like the overlaps of cohesive languages rather than people who know more than one, or spaces in which, or even the linguistic. So when I started this project, I was looking for resources. One was contact linguistics, but again, contact linguistics is the idea that there are two languages that come into contact. But Persian has been in India for 800 years. Can you talk in 1500 of it's being a contact between, or is it any less? Even if, again, it has an ideology of prestige that makes it, or prestige meaning coming from elsewhere. So ideologically, we'll say that we're not, but still, it's been as much part of the local space as the other language. So contact, I find, also kind of not a very, quite a misleading vocabulary.
I actually cannot help escape the political dimension and identity politics. It depends what language are we talking about, right? So, for example, if we are talking about the Migrant and the use of French, so we cannot escape but talk about the anti-colonial project. So, what about the local languages? This is another thing. And even the Persian, which existed 800 years in India, it still has a political dimension in there of the ancient invaders or whatever. And then we have something like the nationalization of language, like the the projects of Arabization of
Yeah.
science, for example, because there is a problem, a crisis
Yes.
when you talk
Yes.
about when you start to use certain
Absolutely.
terminologies, and on the other hand, also the pan-Arabist movement, which started probably in the 30s and was at its peak in the 50s and 60s. The main, to talk in Deleuzian terms, machine of power and structure and hierarchy. So I don't know how could we also implement the notion of multilingualism to other spaces.
Oh, absolutely.
Where the language is, the so-called mother tongue is very dominant. And we do not have like various different local languages. It's again.
But where? You know, in a sense, where is it? You know, where is it that there are not other languages? I think is the question.
Exactly. I mean, like in Egypt, we still have the hieroglyphs. The Coptic, which is not written but spoken only in Nubia.
Or I suppose you're thinking other different languages, or in case of Arabic also different registers, isn't it?
Exactly.
So
but then it is
which are so different.
Yeah, but it is also put as something that is integrated. I mean, the multilingualism. I mean, again, the foreign words. So I have in Egypt, for example, we have like German words like Alesta. It comes from Alice Club, so it was just really Egyptianized.
So I mean, to go to your
but
point.
is this one?
Because
it conforms actually to
sure.
Egyptian.
You could say it's a long word that has become, no, absolutely. I mean, about language politics, it seems to me one of the things that I would say is that I think there are different politics for every language, within each language. So actually it's just to say that, French is only the colonial language. Also Arabic is only is the carrier of, as I say, I think tends then to pit them against each other in an antagonistic way, that of course has its reason, but then also forces out other politics that are also vehicled through Arabic or through French. So, which are, I suppose, more of both end. So I think I think it's quite interesting that, or that in fact may resist a particular kind of Arabization. So let's say yes, absolutely, by all means we should have education in Arabic, we should, but maybe not necessarily that kind of language politics, or absolutely we should have French or English, but not with that particular language politics. So, and I think it seems to me that certainly, if I look at the case of Morocco or Algeria, the kind of the forced Arabization in a way that did not recognize and that made foreign or did not make space for the other languages that were already there, whether it's Kabyle or French, and that antagonized them so much. I mean that backfired, didn't it? So that in a way the idea that so that going back to some of the initial propositions, so the idea that we shouldn't think that a language cannot do or doesn't do, so the language that you can't have, not that you have a lot with the kind of the colonial language, you can't have science, you can't have this. So the force you have to have, the whole of education in French or higher education in French, because you can't have. Obviously, that's not right, and that's a kind of a policy with serious consequences. But I think also the other policies that says, you shouldn't, or that French is only the language of, English is only the language of. Kabyle or Tamazight will weaken our national unity. I think that's obviously something that has not So then language becomes very much part of the problem of post-colonial states, you know, and I mean, even in South Asia, it's part of the problem in all the states, you know, it's not because they're multilingual polities and multilingual societies, and you can't impose monolingualism on them without creating huge, you know, or you can't just say everybody learn English, you know, as a way of, as a solution, or everybody learn French. Interesting also, you know, I work more with language, with literatures. So a colleague of ours works in Bengali. She said actually, even in Bengali, when Bengalis learned English and those who learned English always read Bengali, you know, there was a mutual enrichment, and it was better for both. So, you know, the idea that actually, when we choose for nationalistic reasons to stop reading, you know, or to devalue reading or learning foreign languages, that's also not good, or the previous colonial languages, they're also not good, because they are also often the vehicles of you know, openness to the rest of the world. You know, they're not just, I mean, that's the point I make about English in India. From at least the early 20th century, it's no longer about being a periphery of England. It's about, I mean, that's an argument that Lilith made in one of his papers, you know, is a means of actually reading Russian, French, Chinese, Japanese, and showing how English literature is actually, you know, only part of the world, and it's not even the richest part of the world. So you can use the colonial language to actually provincialize the colonial culture or the colonial literature. So as I say, you know, French is also very much that kind of perform
But
that
it
kind
never works
of
the other
literature.
way around, right?
Now, was that
That in English, for example, there is no, except for America, of course, but it's a predominantly English-speaking country. You don't see this multilingualism when it comes to like Hindi or Arabic.
Yes, absolutely. And I think,
Vietnamese.
for me, you know, it's a real, you know, it's one of the big, you know, it's a really big issue with this global Anglophone, that now, you know, you want to read Chinese literature, read it in English. You want to read, you know, Japan, read it in English. You want to read, you know, there's so many that you can do it through English. That actually, that whole role of English as the means for the circulation of literature in other languages, to me, has diminished, even though actually translations seem to still be happening. But they are much less visible. So somehow I think it's become even more possible now for an English reader to not read translation at all. Whereas I think, you know, again, even in the 1950s, certainly the 19th century, certainly the early 20th century, I mean, would you be a reader of literature without having read the Russians, without having read the French, without, you know? There was no way that you could just read English. And actually for me, again, it's a kind of big paradox now that world literature is kind of booming as the comparative literature for the global, you know, world, that because of this also boom of the Anglophone, actually there's much less world. You know, you're saying you're doing world, but you're doing world only in English, and you're making so much of what is going on in the world invisible.
How do we think about, in relation to this, how do we think about writers like Naipaul and Derek Walcott at one point, who wrote in a local register of English, incorporating Patwa, Argot, the ways in which particular kinds of people, particular communities used English. And even now when you think about writing that comes out of Africa, that there are large numbers of writers who write in English but who incorporate a lot of African words, and now they're allowed to stand in the language, they don't require translation. And so that's one kind of thing. The other kind of thing is how do we put this alongside the fact that there are the Oxford English Dictionary of Caribbean English, Oxford Dictionary of Indian English, So, is this part of a multilingualism,
Yes,
recognition of
yes.
multilingualism, and does it reflect the instability of English or the power of English? So there are these questions that arise again, that even when you have one language, which is predominantly a world language, it
Yeah.
becomes a world language through ceasing to be
Yeah.
itself.
Yeah.
Right? That it can't maintain its identity,
Yeah.
in some kind of singular, hermetic
Yeah,
kind
sure.
of way.
No, I mean that's you could say that's the other side of the global anglophone. That the fact that it has shown how Queen's English is only a small part of English in the world. So of course that's very much that's very much the argument that we make. It's a sort of post-colonial kind of argument about English that is post-colonial English. At the same time, however, it seems to me that it's as if this presence or this making visible the presence of other languages in English is obviating the need for translation. It's like substituting the fact that and what is to me is quite interesting is when you make other languages visible, and so it seems like, okay, yes, it's the world. The world can be made visible through English, but it's like other languages or spoken words rather than written literature, so to say. Right? So that and of course the Caribbean or those kind of spaces are particular ones, but think of Africa, so for example, or think of South Asia. Okay, you can have the Rushdie showing that there is this, there are these sort of English, Hindi words, Urdu words, and so on and so forth. But I mean, he's also the one who says there's no, no. I read the translations and I found nothing worth translating. So now just read English. You don't need to read any other literature. So actually, it's a bit of an ambivalent formation, you could say. And also because I think it performs that post-colonial gesture of writing back, speaking back, while in fact making these worlds or these literary worlds largely visible, which is it's a problematic one for me.
Sorry, I'm not sure I'm following.
Yes, yeah.
So are you saying, in just the last part of our conversation, that are you commenting on there being no need for translation in the Anglophone literary market in them? Not no need, but because and I may be totally wrong, and probably I'm not even on the same page as you are, in the sense that I'm probably not getting what you are saying, but because it seems to me that, especially I've been kind of very close to the organizing team of the Italian the FIL, the Festival of Italian Literature in London, and that actually when you read, especially some reviews like a Syntety, or there has been a great boom lately of which wasn't the same case just maybe 5 or 10 years ago, of foreign to English literature in translation in English, so much that in some sense, of course it's just a market thing or whatever, but for example the world of Italian literature seems to be much more on the shelves of bookshops, and the pages are cultural pages of the journals, and hopefully in the minds of English readers. So I don't know if that's what you were saying. And at the same time, sorry, I was also trying to think that maybe and I totally agree with some kind of somehow maybe pessimistic kind of view of the restriction, but isn't it also that we think about, because we think from the also ourselves from the Anglosphere, because we are here, whereas when we step to, for example, the Italian literary sort of not just market, but the landscape. And Italian is also, in many sense, a very monolingual country, and we are, I think, famous for translating everything. Like, we don't. Well, now it's much more common to look. I know, like my friends that do not speak, but then again, that overhearing of English. But they wouldn't say they can speak English, but they watch TV series in English sort of language, with the subtitles, which was actually, it struck me when the first time I moved to Portugal 15 years ago, that everything was not dubbed, because we dubbed everything in terms of television, etc. So also maybe and I don't know if that's the situation in other countries, but then this tyranny, let's say, of English is much.
Yes.
And then again, sorry, let me just add this, but then another problem could also be, I don't know if you followed the case of Hong Kong and the vegetarian a couple of years ago, last year, and how, the translation was kind of problematic from Korean to English. I believe, and this is problematic to me, that the Italian translation was from the English translation and not from the Korean. So then that's also another level of, problems in the circulation of languages and literatures in world languages and how we. But maybe I'm just.
No.
Okay.
So, and actually, working on literature now, I've become a great fan of indirect translation. I think, indirect translation is, made a lot of things circulate very widely, and then when we became very kind of snooty or about indirect translations, and a lot of things have not just again become invisible. So I've got this thing about visibility and invisibility, and I completely agree. I think that's very much an Anglophone position. But I think at the time when the Anglophone is so dominant, the Anglophone position is actually, you can't just say, oh, it's just the British, or it's just just the American, and say, well, we don't, we translate, we German, we French, we Italian. Translate much more, which we do, of course. And I think, if I'm correct, and in fact, this is something that in our project we want to sort of follow up in this, which is our last year, is how much of translation now happens through web magazines, rather than actually, physical magazines or your mainstream. Because I look at the Guardian review, I look at the London Review of Books, I look at the Times Literary Supplement, New York Review of Books, and you hardly ever get any translation whatsoever. Whatsoever. When you find one, you think, wow. You find two, you think, this is a good week. So, and I think it's quite interesting that then other spaces, as you say, have been open, and actually maybe even as a reaction, I don't know, of saying, there must be something more, or this can be all that actually through Words Without Borders, or then even within Arabic there are as I know, sort of web magazines where there's much more about books that or things that are otherwise not visible in the bookshelf, on the bookshelves, because actually I think there are very few bookshops where you go and you find a lot of foreign books on the bookshelves. It's quite interesting that there's some blogger called Anne Morgan who a couple of years ago did a blog called A Year of Reading the World, in which she decided to read a book from every country recognized in the world. And at first you think, it seems like you read a book and you actually it's not. No, it's actually very interesting and very good, because in fact she doesn't look for the obvious. And, so the Indian one is a Malayalam translation of Malayalam.
Scored.
How do we like her?
And interestingly, the book that she wrote together with a blog was on how difficult it was, even in the age of Amazon, where supposedly, you can click and get everything, how difficult it was to get books from, the less obvious countries, or books from, and another point together with that is that, for example, we know, and somebody was saying that, it's actually quite a boom time for translation in India, for example, at the moment. There's a lot of good translation going on. but it doesn't go outside India. You know? So it doesn't go. You know, it's very interesting again. Well, literature theory is, you know, once David Amrosh, once something is translated, then it travels. It doesn't. You know, it can and it cannot. You know, there are all sorts of other obstacles that that then make. Just to stay with an example that you also know, you know, the Shahbag novel translated from Kannada, I think, into English, published by Faber in London. India, and you say, well, actually, you know, there are lots of these fresh voices that are published every year. If only you bothered, you know, looking at them. And I don't know if it's different in Arabic, and I know that in fact, you know, this sort of now phenomenon of the prizes and the festivals, in a way, is a way also of trying to overcome the reluctance to translation. But it seems to me the Anglophone position at the moment is much more reluctant to invest, let's say, also in translation and really making translation much more of a niche thing, an adventure, one than a kind of, as I was saying recently to somebody who did a book on that, you know, for an Italian to read in translation is like a basic condition of being a reader. You know, how can you not? What would you read otherwise? Rather than, oh, I will read now The Adventurers and read a translation.
I just want to take a step back.
Sorry, I'm now going into my new pet thing about what it is.
I didn't think that, but just take a step back into some of the things that you were saying. You know, when we think about this multilingualism, there are, you talked yesterday about a few scholars, right? Or people who are lower level gentry who acquire languages. And so there's a knowledge, so to speak, of particular languages and working with them. Then in Maluktas, you use the phrase quasi-Persian. So there's a kind of bricolage that's happening, where you grow up in a landscape of languages, you probably don't engage in so it's all about auditory stuff. So when Maluktas puts down these verses which are not perfect Persian, not perfect Hindi, not perfect anything, but it's also to a landscape where people are hearing a lot of words, so they catch on. And then if you leap to the present, and I'm thinking about this conversation that I had with a Moroccan Uber driver in Paris, where he had the phone, the Google Translate, and he would speak into it in French, and it would come, and I would read it in English, and I would speak in English, he'd read it in French. So there's a lot of prosthetic multilingualism that has become possible as well right now, where you don't need the knowledge of anything. There is a kind of algorithm that allows you to function. So that I can travel to China and not know Chinese, nor indeed know my language all that well, but I would still be able to be multilingual in a kind of prosthetic, using a prosthetic kind of way. So that I think it's a whole set of issues that one could actually, you know, once you move out of an earlier paradigm of scholarliness and the aura of text, which goes back to this question about Hankam. Do you actually need to translate from the Korean, or can you translate from an English translation of Korean into Arabic, and that's fine. You know, it's a...
No, sorry, I never thought about, and actually maybe linking to a question that was asked last time. So I think there's people also talk about post-monolingualism, no? So that, you know, there's a book called The Post-Monolingual Condition. You know, so the idea that it's a different multilingualism after a certain idea of languages as monolingual, or people as monolingual, or nations as monolingual, has already been ingrained. So I think it's a Turkish scholar. So, and it seems to me that, for example, you know, what Maluk and others do, quite a lot of others do, at the time with Persian, is now coming only in difficulty, you know, for example with English, you know, what we call English now, into literature, because there has been now a much stronger sense of, no, you either write in proper English or you write in proper Hindi, and then English is a kind of is good for either satire or kind of humor or sort of light or advertising or for cinema or for songs, but not for proper literature. Sorry, that was not really linked to what you were saying, but and I think to me the Google Translate is a bit like what you were saying the other time about the language of sailors or the language of people who don't who learn all these cosmopolitan places or sort of subaltern cosmopolitans, you could say, workers and so on, who don't study languages but who make do, make do with a few words, make do with phrases, make do with sort of whether they then kind of those coalesce into pidgins or not. I suppose that's where all the pidgin comes.
But this is also a political thing, because what happened in Paris, you are Indian and Toronto Moroccan, right? So in a certain way you are both like not from here, or actually strangers. But I very much doubt that a biological French driver would have done the same. Or if you go to Germany, ride with a taxi with a German driver, also biological German driver, this kind of willingness is not there. And it's like you have to conform all the time to the language of the society. So again, it's not only about literature, but also about the spoken. Look at, just reminded me of the dubbing. The Germans, they are terrible. I used to watch Eddie Murphy in German. It's a very racist thing as well, because a German actor is talking like this because he is like doing the voice of a black African American actor.
Right.
So I think that when we talk about local languages, multilingualism of local languages is much different than the binaries. So, which I hate the binary things, but this is the truth actually. This is how life goes specifically in the West, and now with the rise of the right wing all over. So in German, for example, you really shouldn't use any foreign word. You shouldn't. That's wrong, right? Even in talking, you cannot say I'm going to a meeting. You have to say I'm going to einem Treffen. You have to say a meeting. So if you are German, it might be okay, but for someone like me, even though I lived there for 17 years, it's a no-go, right? But sorry, I really need to ask you about something which is a little bit beyond the scope. I found it highly interesting that you use Sufi poetry. I don't know Urdu or Hindi, so I don't know if there is a third pronoun, not made female. No. But this is, I can't find, but just to make the remark that for many scholars, and this is also my view, the main crisis of Sufism is language.
Crisis in what sense?
Because, for example, one of the tragedies that happened with Al-Hallaj, for example, so because he was saying things in a certain language, which is Arabic, very mystically, that got him killed. And also when you say like in the Quran, nothing is like him, but then you are actually using the masculine. So how God is like nothing, but still is a masculine. So when the book of the Tawasin, which actually a French guy found the manuscript, so when he was talking about the letters and talking about Satan or Iblis, right? So when he said that I am the truth and the truth is mine, and the truth in Arabic is a haq, so it's one of the names of God. So many scholars actually say that the problem or the crisis of Sufism is language itself, whether it is Arabic or non-Arabic. So
sorry, still don't
It's a
understand
little bit beyond
no,
the
I
scope.
still don't understand by crisis. I mean, is this the idea of crisis that language traps you even when you don't want to be trapped? You know, when you want to go beyond.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, from the point of view of
Right.
the theologians,
Right.
which I,
Yeah.
but this is something that got the Sufis in trouble for all the history.
Yeah, but then I think within, so I mean, I suppose again it depends historically or, you know, where, because, you know, you get a lot of, you know, Indian Sufis saying, and, you know, as Al-Hallaj said, you know, so, you know, there are contexts in which, in fact, that becomes, as you know, the kind of the martyrs of love, the martyr, you know, it's a great thing, you know, you die for love, you know, what can there be, what better fate there can be. So, and actually, so I mean, I suppose an interesting thing, because I mean, a lot of Sufism in North India, but I think also in the South, I mean, comes through Persian, in fact, rather than, you know, so Persian doesn't have masculine and feminine, you know, whereas Indian would do, you know, though other Indian languages don't. So, and one of the things that in fact they like about, they get interested, not this one here, I think, you know, I'm going to put it here, but the same Sufi al-Qudus, he, one of the equivalences that he makes is, you know, in Persian you say the dost, the friend, and in Hindi instead it's the poetic language that is used is the one in which it's the woman pining for the male beloved, so for the male husband or the male beloved, and so, you know, that is something that they interestingly, I think that they see as a kind of expansion of language, so that you can say this way and you can say this way, and so you can have all the, you know, that's why they are very attracted to particular keyword in a lot of popular Hindi poetry, which is what they sort of get mostly, which is viraha or longing, you know, the idea of a woman whose husband has gone away or beloved is away. So then that becomes a kind of keyword in North Indian Sufism as a condition of, you know, the seeker who is always in a state of, you know, painful longing and so on, and so it's a kind of an extension of the vocabulary that is, or of the idiom that is Arabic, Persian, and now is.
Okay, here it's interesting. I didn't notice that earlier, but why is there? I realized everything is he himself. Because there is no masculine. It's the contrast
True.
between aura and apna,
Yes.
the other and me.
Yeah.
There is no gender
That
there.
is true. That is true.
So, whose
Yeah.
translation is this?
Money.
Apologies.
No, well, I suppose, but here in a way, I mean, so our understanding within Persian sort of poetic vocabulary, when you know, the dost or the beloved is usually, you know, it's this beautiful beloved with you know, just a bit of beard and the hat
Right.
on the side, so it's not, you know, it's not a female beloved. And then of course there's a whole question of are they all, you know, but and then it's God, you know, the idea that then if it's God then it will be him, I suppose, as a by implication. It won't be a she God.
No, aura no koi and savi apna soy. I mean, it's not aura no koi. There's nothing
No,
other
no,
to
no.
me and nothing.
Yeah,
me.
no, but actually there's another one in
Oh,
which
there's another
he's,
verse, yes.
another verse in which he says, you know,
Right.
I want to, where the self is addressing, the I is addressing the Saki, so the female friend, so we know that he's a female self, and he's saying I want to play with my pia, and that's a male pia, and I'm a female, and you know, so then the gender is very clear in that context, not this particular one.
But we should probably remind them. So
Okay.
thank you so
You're
much. Actually, it's such a dense set of ideas. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you, well,
And,
I hope
and all this will circulate through our work as we, in each of our individual works in various ways. I think because personal language and the question of a landscape of languages is there in all our thinking about the global south. And whether we
No, and I hope you didn't get the sense that I'm saying of a one multilingual. No,
No.
In fact, I'm saying